Hi, my name's Phil. I like to come out politics. So, in an interesting development, presumably as part of Labour's new approach to Farage, Keir Starmer has been explaining how the rise in small boat crossings is linked to Nigel Farage's Brexit. He's even referring to the boats as Farage boats. But what message is Starmer hoping to get out to the public here? And if it works, might it get people to reevaluate Brexit impact in other areas of our life? But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So Brexit is still the great divider in Britain, and something Labour have been acutely aware of as they seek to unite voters around the work they're doing on workers' rights, the NHS, public transport, housing, energy and so on, rather than splitting people up over Brexit. So although there have been plenty of statements from Starmer and his senior ministers attacking Brexit for various problems the UK now faces, they've tended to do it fairly low-key. You will come across them if you follow politics closely, but the masses probably miss them. Not a lot of people watch, for example, the Mansion House speech. But Starmer now referring to the small boats carrying irregular migrants across the Channel as Farage boats, specifically because of the link between Brexit and migrant crossings, is different. Farage boats is an attempt at mass messaging, isn't it? Starmer wants to amplify this argument to the wider public, it would appear. So far, the big statements about Brexit have been more about the positives of reversing it rather than explicit attacks on the concept itself. Labour have heavily promoted the idea of protecting jobs and keeping the cost of living down by working more closely with the EU and striking deals with them. Now, there is a strong implication that Brexit caused damage there, because if you're going to argue that reversing the divergence which followed Brexit is good for the UK and its people, there's a heavy implication that Brexit itself was therefore bad. But implication is all it has so far been. This seems a little different. Starmer's been talking about the Dublin Agreement. He's been pointing out that we had a returns agreement with every EU country before Brexit. He said that Farage promised the public that leaving the EU would make no difference to this, but he was wrong. Which is a kind way of saying he was lying, by the way. Which is when Starmer said these boats, in many senses, are actually Farage boats. Reform UK have tried to counter that by saying that we were net recipients of asylum seekers under the Dublin Agreement. In other words, the arrangement meant we had to take more asylum seekers than we returned, so the Dublin Agreement wasn't good. However, this isn't quite true. Before 2016, not the case at all. It only became true for literally the last few years of our EU membership, after the Brexit referendum and when the Tory government basically removed themselves from the decision making in the EU. And the BBC produced a nice handy little chart to show you this. Now, you may look at this and you go, hang on a minute, Phil, the transfers out was on a downward trajectory before that point. True enough, but so too were transfers in. Then there was a huge spike in transfers in at the time of the Brexit referendum. The year before the Brexit referendum, as pointed out by the BBC, we accepted 131 via the Dublin Agreement, but returned 510. So what happened? After all, we were still in the Dublin Agreement between 2016 and 2020 when the small boat crossings started to increase. Well, according to the Migration Observatory, who research migration patterns, once asylum seekers learned that the UK was going to leave the EU and therefore exit the Dublin Agreement, they started favouring applications in the EU. Remember, back in 2016, after the referendum result, the stated intention from the government was that we would leave the EU very quickly. So a lot of people thought we would exit the agreement within a couple of years. So basically what happened is that because of the Brexit result, even before we left, we were seen as a better route to asylum. So Nigel Farage claims the EU is a barrier to managing asylum. The reality is the opposite. And this is one of the really annoying things about people like Farage. He ran a political campaign which successfully browbeat the Tory government into leaving the EU, claiming it would reduce immigration. The reality is it massively increased immigration, both asylum claims and most especially economic migration. Now he's making political capital out of the consequences of his own policies simply because he wasn't directly managing them. It's like, oh, it's because they didn't do it properly. If I was in charge, it'd be fine. It's a bit like someone advising you to cure your child's headache by amputating their head. Then when you say, oh, the child died, they turn around and say, well, that's because you messed it up. They'd have been fine if I'd done it. Before Brexit, there were next to no small boat crossings. The problem with channel crossings is, of course, not entirely down to Brexit. Like everything else with Brexit, there are other factors in the mix. Parts of Africa and the Middle East have become much less stable over the last decade, largely on the efforts of Farage's mate Putin, meaning the world does just have more refugees. If you allow climate change and geopolitics to make people unsafe in their own homes, you are going to create more refugees. More refugees means more asylum claims everywhere. You can't pull this bullshit about first safe country because you cannot expect a few countries to shoulder the entire burden just because they happen to be next door. Like if Denmark went batshit crazy all of a sudden, for example, and suddenly half of Denmark needed to flee and come to Britain, you can bet your ass these same people would say other countries should take their share. But although there are other factors as well, it's a fact that much of the noticeable issues that we have with both regular and irregular migration in Britain has been caused by Brexit. It is a fact that Brexit made the situation worse than it otherwise would have been, just like inflation. Other things contributed to inflation as well, but Brexit made it worse. So how exactly did Brexit make this worse? Well, being outside the EU means that if someone claims asylum in the EU and fails, they can come to Britain and try again. Beforehand, we'd have just said, no, you've already tried it, and it would come up on the database that they'd already tried and failed, and they'd be deported. That is no longer the case. So we basically allow people trying to claim asylum an extra chance with their backup. The Dublin Agreement, unlike what Reform says, meant we returned more than we received, right up until the point when Farage got his way, right? Right up until that point. So given that the small boat crossings only became a problem after this country agreed to do what Nigel Farage said, and the Migration Observatory have explained the causal link there, how there was a change in migrant behaviour as a direct result of our imminent exit from the Dublin Agreement. Because now we have this situation, particularly since Brexit has happened, and we are out of the Dublin Agreement, we now have the situation where not only are we getting a lot more asylum claims, well, we're getting some more asylum claims because it goes up and down, than we used to, but we're also getting extra ones from people who've tried in the EU and failed, but we don't know that. So it is probably fair for Starmer to describe the crossings as Farage boats. Now, although I keep saying that I wish Labour would simply stop talking about immigration and asylum altogether, except when asked, I mean, don't blank questions, because they keep mangling the message anyway, and they'd be on firmer ground on policy areas where Farage is weaker. Nonetheless, if they insist on talking about it, it will be interesting if this sparks off a proper discussion about what impact Brexit really did have. Of course, for that to happen, Starmer's going to need to keep using this line. It's going to need to take hold in the public's imagination. He's going to have to repeat it a lot. Literally like this. Prime Minister, what have you got to say about the latest data on channel crossings though? Oh, you mean the Farage boats? You know, like literally every time someone asks about channel crossings, correct them to, oh, you mean the Farage boats? Right, let me explain then. Before answering, every single time. I'd enjoy that. But let me know what you think in the comments below. For more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.